to this session as part of the Cork International Short Story Festival on the short story state of the art. My name is Tanya Hirschman and I'm a short story addict. I felt that this was a safe space to talk about that because I know that I'm amongst friends. If you were expecting Eva Ryan to be moderating this, unfortunately she had a schedule clash. And I'm delighted to have been asked a couple of weeks ago to step in because right at that time I was writing a feature article on the state of the short story in the UK for the UK writing magazine Mislexia. So it's really, really interesting to me to be here, just so you can see our panel, and to have a chance to hear what the view is from over here, what the state of the short story is from where all of us and all of you are sitting. And we have a fantastic panel here today who are all short story writers and have all published at least one short story collection, but are also here with other hats on, all sorts of different hats. Many of them teach. They haven't actually got their actual hats, but Rob does. I don't know if he's actually brought it. They teach, they edit journals and anthologies and run a live lit event. So we're coming at this from many different angles, but also we have an audience full of short story readers, short story writers, publishers and editors. So I have asked the panel each to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes about their take on the state of the short story. And then we're going to open it up to discussion, and we would love to hear from all of you. A Q&A, but not just questions. We would love to also hear your comments and your thoughts about how the situation for the short story looks for you, and also any ideas that you have, things that you would like to see happening with the short story. Maybe we'll have disagreements. Maybe we'll have fist fights. I think the short story deserves a few fist fights, frankly. So I'm now going to introduce our panel. I'll introduce all of them in the order that they're going to be talking to us. The word acclaimed and award-winning will come up quite a lot. I'm going to start first with, on my far left, Nuala Ní Cruthóir. I've been practicing saying her name for the past 9 years of our friendship. I think I'm doing all right. Also known, her pen name is Nuala O'Connor. And Nuala's 5th short story collection has just been published, Joyride to Jupiter. She was born in Dublin, lives in East Galway. She's also a poet and a novelist. Her 3rd novel, Miss Emily, about the poet Emily Dickinson and her Irish maid, was shortlisted for the, this is where my pronunciation's going to fail me, Energy Eastern Book Club Novel of the Year 2015. And Nuala's 4th novel, Becoming Belle, will be published in 2018. And with her other hats on, she's also a teacher of short story workshops. She's guest edited The Stinging Fly, among other journals, and she's judged short story competitions. Our second panellist tonight is Tom Morris, and he's from Caerphilly in South Wales. He studied English and philosophy at Trinity College Dublin, and he devised and edited the short story anthology Dubliners 100, which was published in 2014. His debut short story collection, We Don't Know What We're Doing, was published by Faber, and it won the English Language Wales Book of the Year and also the Somerset Maugham Prize and the Rhys Davies Fiction Trust Award. And he's just beginning his tenure right now as writer-in-residence at UCC here in Cork. So those of you who live in Cork, please do invite Tom for dinner quite often. Welcome, Tom.
I'm very hungry.
Maybe even tonight. Our 3rd panellist is Danielle McLaughlin, here on my left. And her stories have appeared in The Stinging Fly, The Irish Times, The New Yorker. Her first collection is called Dinosaurs on Other Planets, and it was published by The Stinging Fly in 2015. Not The Stinging Fry, that's an entirely different publisher. And she's won many short story competitions. And she had a story that was published, a flash fiction, in The New Yorker last week, which is fantastic, which I do urge you to seek out. And alongside her own short stories, she co-runs, together with Madeline Darcy, a live lit event, a regular, is it monthly fiction event?
Yes, last Sunday of every month.
Last Sunday of every month, called Fiction at the Friary, here in Cork. And our final panellist tonight is Rob Doyle, and he's a novelist and short story writer. His first novel, Here Are the Young Men, was selected as one of Hot Press magazine's 20 greatest Irish novels from 1916 to 2016, so no pressure at all there, Rob. His second book, This Is the Ritual, is a short story collection that was just published by Bloomsbury. His writing has been widely published in The Guardian, Voice, BBC World Service, Observer, Dublin Review, and he is the editor of Dalkey Archives' Anthology of Irish Literature, which is coming out this October.
It was supposed to be. I got an email the other day saying it won't be out now because of various reasons outside my control until spring of next year.
So
it'll be worth the wait.
Yeah, so we've got a little more time to build up the excitement of that one. Wonderful. So those are our 4 panellists. I've asked them all to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes, gently suggesting that they perhaps talk about 2 things that they're really excited about in terms of the state of the short story, and perhaps 2 areas where there is room for improvement. So could we please start with Nuala? Yep.
And the thing to say is none of us know what the other person's going to say, so if Nuala says all of my points, I'm not going to have.
I'm not at all worried that we're going to run out of material to discuss. We've only got an hour, guys.
I'm going to be quite parochial, I suppose, and talk about the Irish context. And I think, so you asked us to think about 2 sort of very positive things, and I would say our small press publishing scene in Ireland is second to none. That we have excellent publishers like the Stinging Fly Press, Ireland House, Trumpet Press, who else do we have that's on my little list? Thera Press in Galway, who are willing to publish short story collections. So they're willing to take a chance on new people, and they're also willing to publish collections from people who are established. So that's fantastic. Allied with that is also our healthy literary journal scene. We have great literary journals, again, The Stinging Fly, Tangerine, The Moth, Banshee, and on like that. So those are the things that I feel that we have a very healthy community supporting the short story, okay? So that's my first positive point. My second positive point is that our critics are interested in the short story also. And so that we are reviewed as short story writers. Both in the broadsheets like the Irish Times and the Examiner and the Independent and the Sunday Business Post, but also in places like the Dublin Review and the Dublin Review of Books and other places that are online that are have a very healthy sort of critical attitude to the short story. We're taken seriously as short story writers, I feel, in Ireland. When I think about the negative side of things, or the things that are sort of ripe for improvement, I think about the branches of big publishing houses that are here in Ireland who do not seem to be that keen to promote the short story or publish the short story, and I find that a little disappointing. Places, I'm referring really to places like Penguin Ireland and Hachette, who almost exclusively publish novels and non-fiction. They do have some short story writers, but they're sort of few and far between, I would say. And married to that is the fact that when magazines with wide publication in this country, and I'm talking about things like women's glossy magazines like Image and Tatler, and also something like the RT Guide, which is probably in 80% of homes in Ireland. It's like a TV magazine. When they commission short stories, weirdly, they often ask writers who are not short story writers. So they ask people who are more naturally novelists, and actually usually more naturally commercial novelists. And so I feel that the short stories that the general public, not us, the short story writer community, gets to read, that the person who needs to be convinced to enjoy short stories is often fed short stories that are maybe not of the highest quality. And that is an issue, because if we're going to try and convince people to read and enjoy short stories, they have to have access to the best stuff. And literary magazines, no matter how much we love them and support them, are a niche product or thing or whatever. So I think because of those things, there is a sense sometimes that we in this community are talking only to ourselves, and that we're finding it very difficult to talk outside of ourselves and to get ourselves heard, and for people to really discover the absolute joy of short stories, you know. I'm not into this attention span thing, you know, reading, they're both fiction, short stories and novels, but they're just hugely different entities, and people, in a sense, need to learn how to read short stories and learn how to enjoy them. And I would love if, I do appreciate that the Irish Times runs the Hennessy, and you know, a lot of people can read that, but I would love if more of the women's magazines would retake up, because they used to publish a story a month, if they would retake that up and really try and connect into the short story community to find out who are the people we need to publish.
Great, thank you, Nuala. It's very interesting to me, coming from the UK, that you talk about that there's a lot of reviews of short story collections, because that's something we're quite short of. It doesn't happen so much in the UK, especially the broadsheet newspapers. Do you think it's, I mean, so often literary journals and these live events, so often it's down to one or two people who've got a great love for the short story who then take initiative and set up the journals. Do you think that's the same? Do you see that in the newspapers as well? It's one or two people who happen to be short story lovers who are in those positions, and really they're the ones who are encouraging this to happen?
I don't think so.
Or is it something more in the zeitgeist of Ireland that there's a respect for the short story and the short story collection?
I think that may be the case, because the people who review, for example, for the Irish Times and for the Irish Independent, they are the people that review a lot of books in those newspapers. So they don't seem to discriminate, which is really heartening when your book comes out and you're actually reviewed everywhere over the span of a few weeks. You know, I think it's unusual, but it's a great shot in the arm for the short story that, you know, maybe once a month there's a good chunky short story book review.
And not all the reviews are saying things like, when short story collections get reviewed in the UK, you get that line saying, wow, what a great short story, it's novelistic in its scope. Yeah. So there's a way to review short stories where you can just talk about the beauty of the short story itself. That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Nuala. We're moving on now to Tom.
I would say, although I do think there's the standard of criticism around is even on it?
Just talk into it.
Oh, that's a great bit of advice. There's always one thing I forget to do is talk into the light. Yeah. I don't know, the amount of short story reviews I read, at the opening paragraph, they talk about Joyce. They say, what is a short story collection? Well, what Joyce meant was this, and then they go, like Joyce or unlike Joyce. You know, why is everyone being put onto those terms? And quite often I think it's good for reviewers, perhaps, you know, that was the only collection they'd read, or they studied that at college, and that's their kind of go-to point. So in Ireland especially, you know, you've got this problem of every book at some point is going to be compared to the Dubliners, and, you know, good luck to you if you're going to come out of that battle, you know, winning. Yeah. Or the other thing you see in reviews a lot is of story collections, but it's a mixed bag, some good, some bad, and it's just like, you know, very reachable within cliches. But to pick up on the questions that you asked us beforehand, so too good, too bad, I'll start with the too bad. One of my kind of bugbears is the way that we talk around the short story. We can't talk about, you know, we all say, oh, it's in good health now, you know, or it's in safe hands, or, you know, there's a resurgence of it. I think, like, if we just don't even talk about them in that terms, we just get past that and just talk about the story on their own terms. I mean, like, this festival is brilliant because you have people here who understand the short story, care about the short story. But I go to other festivals where I might be on a panel with a novelist, and the only question I get asked is to talk about the short story form. And the novelist gets asked, like, oh, that's an interesting character, on page 42 this happens. And I go, Tom, what is a short story? And you just feel like the level of conversation is so much further behind. But I think in some ways short story writers are to blame, because we're just not insisting that we want to talk about the stories, and we're very polite, and we go, oh, well, what is a short story? We scratch our heads, and we wrote out a Frank O'Connor quote about submerged population groups, and we all talk about them in the same way, rather than just being honest and saying, actually, this is what, you know, the story came to me this way. And in a strange way, I feel like the short story is almost like the post-colonial other to the novel, and it's always being defined in relation to the novel. So you go to an event and you go, how is a story different to a novel? I don't think, say, poets have that. If a poet has an event, they don't say, how is a poem different to a novel? You know? And obviously, you know, there's formal, just on the eye you can see how it's different. But again, novelists don't have to put it to that. Put two novelists on there, they're not being asked about the short story. And I think there's a responsibility for all of us, that if you end up chairing an event around short story, but we kind of get into the guts of the work, you know? Like, so I spent 2 years writing the final story in my collection. I went through, you know, so many drafts of it. And then, but I don't get to talk about it. I don't get to talk about the themes, you know, and it's almost as if that doesn't matter, because we have to just talk about the form. That's my one bugbear. And then the second one is around magazines and competitions and the word limits that they give to writers. And it's really understandable. You have a print magazine, there's only so much you can print, so you want a story under 2,000 or 3,000 words, it makes sense. Or for a competition, you're doing a reading, you have to pay someone to read the stories, so it makes sense that you limit it. But it's deranging stories, it's damaging them. I was editor of The Sting and Fly, and I was assistant before that, so I used to read, I'd say around 1,000 stories a year that people were sending in. And we were unique in that there was no word limit, so people could send in a story of 5, 6, 10,000 words. They knew, these writers knew that we would take it seriously, we'd publish it no matter the length, if it was good. But I could see when someone had sent a story that they'd written for the 2,500 word deadline elsewhere, it had the beats were all in the same place. They rose and they fell. And it felt that sometimes, obviously you could have brilliant stories under 2,000 words, but I felt that some writers who, if they were pushed, if they had the permission to write longer, the stories would go into far more complicated, messy, interesting places rather than just trying to wrap it up at the end, get it in under the under the workout. So that's something which we need to look at. But again, there's an economic strain and pressure there often, for people to have to read the book. Positives, I think, there's so many kind of untapped possibilities for the way that we present short stories. And now I'm going to talk about something that I've been doing as this great opportunity. I can just, look what I've been doing.
Please do.
Please do, yeah. I set up something recently called Out of Office Stories, because I realised I never go away for a few days, and I hate email, so I set up an out of office, and I go, I'm away, leave me alone, I'll be back in a few days. And I realised you can put anything in my out of office. And there's a word limit of 1,500 words, so I thought, I could put a story in here. And when someone emails me, I'll send them back a story. So I had this idea, and I discussed it with Colin Barrett, and I said, have you got any little, if you've got any flash fictions, little stories around, something you've published before, And he said, why? I said, well, what I'm doing is out of office idea. And he just wrote me a story in a couple of days, under 1,500 words. And I put it on Twitter. I said, if you want a short story by Colin Barrett, email outofofficestories@gmail.com, and you'll get one back immediately in the out of office. And I got this went up on Twitter, and within about 3 days, 400 people had emailed to get this story. And people kind of loved the novelty of it. The story came back to them instantly. And then the New Yorker asked Colin for flash fiction. He said, I have this one, and it just got published 2 weeks ago. And that's a piece that wouldn't have existed had not this kind of constraint being applied to him. And then the other thing I do is I have a newsletter using TinyLetter, and once every 2 weeks, but I never keep to that. I send out one of my favourite short stories with a little recommendation, a little talk about it. I find the story off the internet somewhere, put it into a PDF, and then send it out. And I've got like 1,000 subscribers, and that goes up every week. And that's what you can do. And I keep looking to music, going, what can we steal? Or whatever forms, what can we steal? And you think of an album, and you have a band, and they have 10 songs on there. They release the album, and then they release singles afterwards. And that is all feeding back in. Whereas what we do with story writers, we publish the stories beforehand, and then we do the book, and then they're locked in there. We can't get those stories out. You're not meant to republish them elsewhere. You've got all this value just locked in the book. And I think that writers should be, if they want to be, writers can do like anyone can do what you want. I'm not forcing you to do anything. But have a bit more kind of oomph around your work and kind of pushing out of it and getting it into other places rather than just going, oh, well, yeah, it's in the book now, and I suppose no one will buy it, and no one will read those stories, and there we go, I published it 2 years ago, and it can't go anywhere else now. No, find a way to get out there. So I think there's a lot of opportunities around that. But I don't want to be the guy on stage going, digital, that's the answer. But, I think we can be more creative in how we get that out there. And even around events, a short story, the beauty of it is that it can be read in a single sitting. And that's like a play or a film, you can make something around that story. I think if we apply some imagination to it, and that's the same for all literary events, I think, we've so conservative a lot of the time. We don't think of this idea of entertainment and what is an audience want. And I think there's so many opportunities around the story and what could end.
Brilliant, that's wonderful. It's really interesting. A couple of things that you talked about. Firstly, this issue with the word counts. One of the things I talked about in my article on Dyslexia is the rise of flash fiction. And there's a huge boom, and I think it's a worldwide boom. Flash fiction, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the term, are very, very short stories, sometimes under 1,000 words or even shorter. And a lot of it is, I think, there are flash fiction competitions because it's a lot easier for the judge to read these tiny stories, and they're just much quicker for everyone to read. But then there was a discussion on Twitter about a year ago. A few people were discussing how long should a short story be, and they between themselves came to the conclusion that a short story should be 2,500 words. And I sort of waded in and said, well, piece of string. I mean, you can't really a short story. And so you're right. What you said about giving people permission, not just to write however long it needs to be, but to let themselves get messy and not worry too much when you're writing. Just see where it goes. And I really like your point as well that maybe as short story writers were a bit too polite. I've been hanging around with a lot of poets. They're not so polite. And I think we could learn from them, especially what you said about in events. Perhaps if we're invited to do events, insisting that we get to talk about some of the meat of the short story rather than, once again, what is a short story and why should anyone be reading them? I think it's a really good point. And your out of office idea, this stuff is really brilliant. And you're using it to create community as well, not just to promote your own work, you're promoting other people's.
But the thing to say as well is like, then if writers don't want to do that, they shouldn't have to either. Like, you know, some of my favourite writers, they don't do any social media, they don't do interviews, and that's great. I mean, it's a work that matters in the end. But in terms of, you know, because I work in publishing as well, I have a light on so often thinking, how can we get it a bit? But, you know, I don't want to pin all of it on the writers and go, do this, do that, because it's the work that matters in the end. And, you know, that's essential.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Danielle? Oh, thank you. Okay.
Well, on a positive first, I feel there's real buzz around short story and a real sense of possibility around it. I've noticed that in Cork, I'm involved in running Fiction at the Friary, which happens once a month in the Friary Bar in the North Mall at Madeleine Darcy, and I run that together. And when Madeleine had the idea for it first, I thought, yeah, that's something I'd really like to go to and would be fun, but I thought maybe it would be Madeleine and myself and maybe 5 or 6 other people just sitting around once a month. And it turned out that there were lots and lots and lots of people who wanted to come along and write, people who'd been writing for a while, people who wanted to start writing. And I'm just so impressed every month with people who will come along and write on the day, because we do writing prompts and people will share their work on the day. There's an open mic section as well. So I just think there's a real sense of possibility, and I suppose when I started writing a few years back, I started writing relatively late, I think, and I wouldn't really have considered that writing was something I could do with my life. And now I notice that people they're much more ready, I think, to say, yeah, I'm going to have a go at writing, and why shouldn't I? And maybe I can write a story and I will share it, and it's great to see that buzz and that possibility. And I think that's linked to what Nuala was saying about the magazines and the small presses, and that there is, I suppose, there's a realistic chance that if you write a story, well then you will see it in print if you persevere, and if you do all the redrafts and you work hard, there is a realistic chance that your story will be published, because there's lots of outlets there. And I think that does make a difference, because I suppose when you're spending hours and hours working on a story, it's a bit disheartening if you think, well, I'm putting in all this time, and is anybody ever going to read it? But if you see that there are stories being published, and there are lots of magazines in print and online as well, I think that does encourage writers to keep going. So I think there's a real sense of possibility around short stories. Also, on the positives, I like the way that when you think about the other forms of written communication that we have, say for example, all the words people write on social media, there's Facebook and Twitter, and you know, I suppose a few years back we could have thought, is that a threat to other kinds of writing, and would people write less when we're engaged in these other forms of written communication? And I like the way that more people seem to be embracing fiction and short stories, even alongside the growth of social media. And I think, well, I don't know, I suppose I can only guess at the reasons for that, but I think that people are still looking for fiction as a way of embracing truths and honesty and interrogating meaning. And if you look at, you know, things that people maybe communicate on social media, a lot of it is fiction and a lot of it is false and a lot of it is on the surface, and it's not really interrogating or exploring, and it's sometimes lacking honesty. And I think perhaps people have this need all the time to go to fiction as a means of excavating things that aren't being properly examined in depth elsewhere, and it's a place that's still very necessary. So I find that very heartening, that with all the technological developments, that we have other forms of communication, that the story is still more necessary than ever, I think. Let me see, I must think of some negatives. I'm feeling quite positive at the moment, actually. Okay, well, just a general small negative, I think, in the way that people talk about short stories. Sometimes there are phrases and kind of concepts that get bandied about, like the Irish short story, or you know, the traditional Irish short story. And I think, well, what is that exactly, and who decided what that was? And, you know, whose tradition are we talking about? And I think ideas that formed around what the Irish short story is or should be, they're really linked to ideas of what got selected for publication and what was championed at particular times over the past century, and maybe what, I suppose maybe what people wanted the particular image of Ireland to be projected. So I think whenever phrases like that are used, we should, you know, maybe do what fiction does, what short stories do, and interrogate them a bit more and question.
Wonderful, thank you. Live literature is definitely another of the strands that I wrote about in my article, which has really been booming over the last decade. These live events where writers can go along and either you read your own story, sometimes actors will read the story if the writer doesn't want to read their own story. What kinds of people come to your event? What kinds of people do you see that you're attracting? I didn't realise that you had a writing session before, so sometimes people are reading the first drafts that they've just written. Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so impressed at the bravery of people who do that. It's absolutely wonderful, and people will, you know, go to the mic and read something that they wrote from the writing prompt, and they had 20 minutes to come up with a story, and they will go to the mic and read it, and it's absolutely fantastic to hear that. And I think it's wonderful as well, you know, I've met people at some of our Friary events, and actually I can see that there's various Friary regulars here today, so it's lovely to see you. Hi, everybody. But it's great to meet people who have come along on their own to the event, and they say, you know, they don't know anybody else who's a writer, they didn't have anyone to come along with, but they wanted so much to write and to be part of that they come along on their own. And it's great because they meet other people who, you know, maybe have come along on their own as well. And people are very friendly and they talk. So that's
brilliant.
And
also,
the bravery of people and embracing, you know.
Yeah, and they've got instant audience feedback as well on their new piece of work, which maybe helps them to see where it might be taken. And also people love being read to, don't they?
They do, and as well as that, I think when I started writing short stories a few years back, I didn't know that many short story writers. I wasn't familiar with a broad range of work at all. And one of the things we do at Fiction at the Fire, thanks to the Munster Literature Centre, we raffle short story collections at every event. So we're, helping, I suppose, writers read more widely and get introduced to more.
That's brilliant, yeah.
I just
Tom.
had an idea for events now. So it's going to be speed dating flash fiction. And you get a prompt, and then you hit up, and then you read what you've written, and then you go on to the next person, and then who knows, you might get married. Short story.
You write one flash story and then you read it to one person, then you each move along and you read your second story
And
to...
there's another prompt, and you just keep going.
Oh my God.
And you sit opposite each other.
You heard it first here.
Yeah.
Okay, write that down. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. Copyright, that's mine. No one will take mine.
Thank you. Ideas flowing thick and fast. Rob?
Yeah, so like Nuala, I'm going to start on a slightly parochial note and talk about the Irish context, because that's what I've been paying attention to the last few years, and I'll wholeheartedly agree that with the small presses, but particularly with literary journals, Ireland is a kind of utopia. I maybe didn't realise it for a while, a few years ago, but from what I've observed, the difference between Ireland and other countries, first of all, there are so many literary journals, which are, it can't really be overstated how important these are to writers, particularly at a certain stage in their career, which is quite early on. I'd certainly include, myself in that a couple of years ago, as I was a kind of budding author before I had published a book. But also in Ireland, because it's a small country, you can, by publishing in these journals, you can actually begin to really get noticed. I sometimes feel, I know there are a few American writers out there, I sometimes feel kind of sorry for American writers because everything seems like a drop in the ocean. Even in the UK, I feel it's somewhat the same because they're just such big populations and such vast geographies in comparison to us. And so you publish something, and then you publish something over here, and nobody's really connecting the dots. Whereas in Ireland, it's that small, it's kind of the flip side of what can be the oppressive and claustrophobic Irish parochialism, is that it has a benefit, which is that people notice stuff, they notice you, and you can begin to build a name for yourself, and that can lead to good things, and you can get your books published and so on. The other thing I think it's worth stressing in a positive sense is in terms of literary journals, and again, I'm mostly focusing on Ireland here, but also abroad, is it's not like in your dyslexia article, which was very interesting and full, that was good, but it focused a lot on kind of quantity. But what I'm excited about is also the question of variety. And what I mean by that is that I feel that there are now outlets, significant, many outlets for formal diversity in short fiction, in short prose in general. The Gorse Journal, I know that Susan Tomaselli that was around here somewhere, she's the editor of that. It's that's a quite new magazine that's been around only for a couple of years, but it's very much trying to kind of carve out a niche. And there are other journals doing the same thing, of it more maybe, what would we say, avant-garde / experimental, continental kind of thing. And I think that's wonderful because I guess I have a kind of a historical narrative of let's say, the evolution of the short story. It's a crude oversimplification, but nonetheless there's something to it. I suppose if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, you could perhaps see that there's maybe two broad avenues or streams of the short story. We've already talked about Dubliners, James Joyce and Dubliners, and also Chekhov. This is kind of a template that's created, and it's about character, it's about personal moments and so on. And many superb writers have worked and continue to work in this tradition. However, not so far apart temporally from that, you had Jorge Luis Borges publishing his Labyrinths and his fictions, and it's such a radically different approach to what the short story is and can be. He had, just to use him as an example of this kind of thing, it's not really about character, it's not really about the moment, you know, the observational details, it's about ideas, it's about metaphysics, philosophical questions, and from a personal point of view, I find that so fascinating, and I find fiction that doesn't leave all that stuff as the preserve strictly of non-fiction and philosophy. Fiction that goes after that, I find great. But, you know, it could be argued that the former school of fiction, let's say the Dubliners / Chekhov template, has assumed a kind of global coup d'etat, a kind of global dominance. It's become almost synonymous with the short story through, when we think of a short story, more often than not, we think of stories which conform more or less to this template. And it can be a little, I personally don't have a deep passion for that. You know, there are exceptions. There are some stories and authors who work in that kind of form who fascinate me, but it's not my kind of go-to form. So I guess I love when I see the kind of the insurgency, you know, the resistance movement, the underground, let's say, breaking out, and these kind of acts of insurrection against that particular global dominance. And yeah, these journals, online journals too, but you know, all these different media that promotes a more open, less clearly defined version of what a short story is or could be, I find could cause for excitement. Yeah. Anything else? Let me see on the negative side of things. I do worry, I guess, a little bit about, I think something that somebody else touched on is the kind of sense of a potentially shrinking audience, the fact that we're perhaps talking to ourselves a little bit, you know, within the world of short story writers. But then again, you know, Tom has been giving some ideas about how that can be broken open. I say the more of that, the merrier. I do, to be a little bit pessimistic about it, I do personally think that there is a rarefied form of concentration that the short story requires. That's not necessarily an easy headspace to get into. And like I think Nuala said, it's kind of something, like a particular form of music, it's something that has to be kind of learned. And it's something you have to really give a bit of time and attention and effort to. And I suppose this is more of a broad existential question hanging over the future of short fiction, but I wonder, as our lives become more and more relentlessly digital and more mediated, and that's only going in one direction, let's face it, it's not, there's no turning back from that. I wonder about the future of that particular form of concentration. And also, I don't know about all of you, but I find it next to impossible to read short fiction, almost of any description, perhaps apart from the flashiest of flash fiction, on a screen, on a device, on a laptop. It just doesn't work for me. My brain scrambles and it short circuits and it doesn't work for me. You know, it's been said many times that at the moment these days we're probably consuming more text than ever. We've become a very text-based culture. We're reading all the time. We're reading on our screens. We're reading on our laptop. But for some reason, I don't think it's only me. I think it's a widespread thing. For some reason, prose which is not fictional, autobiographical prose or non-fictional prose or basically anything apart from short fiction seems to read immaculately easily from various devices, whereas short fiction does not. I'm not really sure where this point is leading, in that I don't know what the solution is, but I'll leave the question mark kind of dangling over it. Where will short fiction go as our lives become more and more absolutely mediated and digital, will it become something that is very much a niche passion? Will it become something that, like listening to a symphony or something like that? It's becoming a kind of something that will become retro. I wonder. Yeah.
Thank you. I really like what you say, that phrase about not what a short story is, but everything it can be. And I always feel when I come across a new short story writer that I've never read before, that every great writer is doing something new with the short story form, and I think, wow, a short story can also be this, and that is really exciting.
Yeah, I think that is, for me, the greatest joy as a reader is when I think, wow, I didn't know
I could do this.
a story could be this, or I didn't know a novel, or I didn't know prose could do this. I didn't know you were allowed to do this. It's a wonderful thing.
And I think, so to pick up on what you're saying about the journal situation, so I've been living, I lived in Ireland for 10 years, then I went back to Wales for a year, I'm from Wales originally, and there's no journals to send it. So what you don't have is a conversation. And in Ireland there's a conversation between the work, if that makes sense. And I know, as a writer, so you write your story and go, where am I going to send it? Do I send it to Stigma and Blind? Do I send it to Course? When you read those magazines and you go, oh, I didn't know you could do that. And the huge thing for a writer is, I think, this idea of permission. Permission to write, and permission to write a certain way. And what the best writers give you when you read their work is that permission. And to me, that's a deeper thing than influence. It's you're allowed to do that. And if you've got that variety of magazines and publications and different kinds of stories being published, and it does open up that possibility and a permission to present anything as a story.
Yeah. Also, one thing I'll just throw it in that I meant to say about the journal situation, and something that's maybe slightly overlooked, but massive benefit of a rich literary journal culture is the kind of laboratory factor, which means even if you're a writer who isn't naturally drawn to the short form, I've written a collection of stories and I'm very proud of it, but it's not, short fiction is not necessarily my kind of go-to form. However, for a few years, I really wanted to kind of muck around and get my hands dirty with different ways of expressing, of using prose, different ways of looking at narrative and so on. And what I found was that I was very motivated to do that in short fiction because I knew that the laboratory conditions were right. There was a laboratory laid out for me. People would present this stuff, so if I wrote it, it would be. That's very useful in terms of the evolution of individual writers.
Being able to experiment in a short space.
And knowing that there is a forum for it.
Yeah.
And in Ireland, like I say, there's an almost utopian forum in that there's many places where, and they have readerships.
Wonderful. I think time is going very quickly. We've only got about 15 or 20 minutes. I'm going to open it up now to the audience. Please, if you have questions, comments, anything at all about how you see the state of the short story from any viewpoint. Do we have anyone? Come on. We stunned you into silence. I know we have publishers in the audience. If anyone would like to talk about the state of short story collection publishing or journal publishing? Really no.
Can I ask
Yes,
a real super quick from Rob? Could you recommend a couple of the more experimental boundary pushing short story writers that you've noticed recently, like if we want to delve?
Yeah.
Because I'm always interested in getting outside. I really love the traditional stuff, and I really want to encourage more boundary pushing stuff from what I have access to. So
yeah. Do you mean from the present or from in general?
how about a couple of each make your work
God, I'll probably get the shocking. Myself, I totally recommend. Seriously.
That's it. I'm writing it down. So,
I suppose, well, this is a very blindingly obvious one, but I'm going to say he's dead now, so it's not exactly cutting edge. But David Foster Wallace, the American,
Sure.
But his short work in particular, he wrote a book. Was it his second last book? I can't recall. It's called Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. Maybe you've read it. And to me, that's an immaculate, absolutely rich and inspiring this sense of permission that Tom talks about, where you read something, you think, oh yeah, of course I can. Why couldn't I? Yeah, of course I can do that. To me, that was a kind of a bit like reading Borges for the first time. That was a collection that kind of opened many doorways in my brain. It was like a massive download coming at me. Of, oh, you know.
Obviously going to course, like.
Well, actually, June Caldwell is probably
Yeah.
this summer. She's doing some stuff that, in the context of the Irish short story, is way out there. On it's got that kind of sense of rabid freedom to it. Who else? Let me see.
Is Robert Coover fit into that for you?
Robert Coover.
Bartholomew.
Bartholomew, yeah. Bartholomew is very much in the kind of American, like post-Borges, postmodern tradition. Yeah, Bartholomew.
Like one of my kind of fears is that, so I've been trying to read more in translation at the moment. And one of my favourite collections I've read in the last few years is Alessandro Zambra, My Documents. It's an amazing collection, and Fitzgeraldo Editions, a brand new independent publisher, published it in the UK, and Sweeney's published it in America, My Documents. But it's hard enough for fiction to get translated, and I wonder, for the story collection to get translated, how much harder that is again, because the publisher looking at the sales is not necessarily.
That's where Comma Press
Yeah.
in the UK are doing absolutely brilliant work. They're translating stories from Japanese and all sorts of stuff, you know. They have like whole collections set around European cities and things. So if you're interested in short fiction and translation, that and Donkey Archives, European short story. What's it called?
The best
Best
European
European
fiction.
short fiction. Yeah, they're brilliant anthologies to read.
There's one that the Donkey thing reminded me of. Is Jean-Philippe Toussaint. I think he's a Belgian author.
Okay.
He writes novels, but also short fiction, and he does some stuff in his short fiction that completely changes my conception of what it can be and what it does. And I discovered him through that Donkey
That's anthology.
anthology. Yeah.
Thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, question over there, yeah.
Just, have you guys any thoughts on audio? What I think there is things like, over the last couple of years, I've gone through the entirety of the New Yorker fiction podcasts, where you get Deborah Friedman discussing with a coach or somebody else's work here being read, and I was thinking why are being doing the same thing. But it seems to me there's a huge online archive of spoken word short stories that is written. Have any thoughts about that?
When I do something like Achievers Reunion with students, I always send them to the New Yorker podcast to listen to Richard Ford read it and discuss it with Deborah Treisman. But yeah, I think there's probably an opportunity there for somebody to do a, there you go Tom, there's something new for you to try. Do one with Irish writers would be fantastic. But
There is this thing in Fly, aren't you? Right?
yes, they've started doing it now. They're back catalogue of many, many years. But yeah, I do think it's very useful. It gives you can listen to Lucia Berlin as well, reading some of her stories online. It's the most beautiful experience. She's a brilliant writer. If you haven't read Lucia Berlin, go out now and buy her book. It's called A Manual for Cleaning Women. Wonderful stuff. She has flash fiction as well as longer stories, and there's, they're just, the settings are unusual, laundromats in places like New Mexico and all, and there's a lovely conversational tone to the writing, and it's very, I find it unusual. It was refreshing to me to discover her. I was very sad to hear she was dead. This is what happens. Sadly.
She's dying of writers.
It's like Arlene Hayman, who was here last year, and her first book came out in her 70s, and she's writing these stunning stories about old people having sex, and they're just jaw-dropping and brilliant and funny and moving and everything, and it took her all that time, despite many, many accolades, to get a book out. And it came out in the UK first, even though she's from New York. They wouldn't touch it in New York until it came out in the UK.
What's her name?
Her name is Arlene Hayman, and the book is called Scary Old Sex. It's brilliant. Highly recommend.
Thank you. Question here? Yeah.
Can I put a damper on things?
Yes,
No,
I like this.
Want
You
it.
already touched on it. You need the Irish branches of the big publishing houses to come on board with a short story. I know this country is a utopia in terms of journals and magazines. It is for the short story. But you're not going to make that breakthrough until the likes of HarperCollins, Hachette, Penguin come on board and start publishing short stories from short story writers, not novelists who have made their reputations as novelists and then get permission to put out their collections out there. And you're probably not going to do it by pushing boundaries or with experimenting with the short story. You're going to do it with short stories that people want to read, and mass of people will go into a bookshop.
Oh, that's an unfair dichotomy.
Is it?
Yes, it is. Again, sorry to cut
No, go ahead.
Yeah. It's just like I said. I think the prevalence of a certain type of short story is completely arbitrary. It's like Sean O'Reilly talked about earlier, the consensus of a certain type of realism. However, I've cut over you, so I'll let you continue.
I think we're approaching a time where literary fiction is even under threat.
Yeah.
Literary novels, the sales of those are plunging. So a short story that goes into that pushes the boundaries of what a short story can do is not going to reach a mass audience. And I think short story writers have to aim to reach a mass audience and sell books. Establish a short story as an art form that is simply in the window of Waterstones, that every novelist will respect a short story, that they will take their place at all festivals. At all festivals will have a short story strand. Now, I mean, to do anything else is to simply give up on the short story, to accept that it is going to be rarefied, that it is going to be read by short story writers and readers. This kind of internal communication of this community will continue. What needs to be done is to get a readership, a mass readership.
But there is huge diversity in short story writing, and the beauty of the short story is that it is malleable and it is elusive and it's strange and it has so much room. It can be anything. And I think there would be an awful danger in trying to prescribe to people what to write and how to write it in order for it to sell, because who knows what sells? The weirdest books become bestsellers.
Claire Louise Bennett's was, if we want to describe it as a short story collection, but it was completely uncompromisingly itself, let's say. I hate the word experimental because it seems like, I don't want to read something that's experimental, but it was very much form breaking, and that seemed to sell plenty.
Yeah, it did very well.
Yeah.
And also it brings up, there's sort of a split, and I wrote about this in my article, between the individual short story and then the collections of short stories, where it's different worlds really. When you're dealing with a book, you're dealing with the whole publishing industry, which is a different animal from when you're dealing with just individual short stories. And I did informal surveys on Twitter to see actually how many short story writers actually are aiming for a collection. And it's not everyone by any means. It was maybe 2/3 who said they definitely wanted a book, but quite a few people weren't so urgently desiring to have a book of short stories, because it's a different beast from the individual short stories.
Yeah, and Callan Wink touched on this last night when he was talking about how many stories he wanted in his collection versus what the publisher wanted. And some publishers have this thing about a collection that it has to have all this cohesion. There's nothing more beautiful than a collection that is not cohesive, like something like Nam Lee's The Boat, where each story is so wildly different. Personally, I prefer that than the one that feels like I'm reading the same short story over and over again. So I think diversity is key in the short story, and we'd be mad to let go of what is right about the short story in favour of large sales.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say a question at the back, because we've only got a few minutes left, so we can always carry on this discussion afterwards, definitely. Yes?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on this
Yeah.
topic. Because I'm a short story writer and I'm also a short story editor in the States. And I think that what this gentleman was referring to, and a bit of the dust up about so-called experimental, is that it's connected to the lack of diverse and underrepresented voices. And that has to be solved on the editor level. So when everyone looks the same, and when editors continue to give the same stories over and over, when the audience continues to receive the same message over and over, that's why it's kind of built into the system that the literature stays the same. But when you have the underrepresented, the new voice that comes in, there's always an audience for it. For instance, Lucia Berlin taught in Colorado for years and years in obscurity. Her collection was published posthumously, and people went wild over it. It was new. It was connected to class. She was from the working class.
Yeah.
She was an underrepresented voice that an editor gave a chance to. So not only does it have to happen on the short story writer level, we all have to help each other out, but the editors also have to get on board and start to look like the world looks and not just like one another. And at that point, I promise you, your readers will be there for that. Because your readers don't want the same old thing either. Because every time you get a new thing, like George Saunders is a great example of a story writer who messes with the form and he has no trouble finding readers. So if you give the voice a chance, the readers will come. Absolutely. I know it.
And to put it into perspective, Lucia Berlin, when a book got translated into Spanish recently, sold 40,000 copies in like the audience was there, this
That's a lovely positive comment. Yes, question about that, yeah.
I'm very interested to hear from Nuala and Danielle particularly. Would you think the fact that you were exposed to soundings and those sorts of texts in school, as well as text Australia and maybe even French like either year old and I've heard that to be the case, that because you were exposed to short stories in a variety of languages, a variety of settings, and you were trained at a very early age to read them in school, whether that has helped the short stories to do well in Ireland as a genre, because we've been looking at it since we were 12, 13.
Yeah, I think so. I loved Dúil, Liam O'Flaherty's Dúil when I was in school, absolutely loved it, and it sent me to his English language books, Famine and that. And yes, distinctly remember being obsessed with Brendan Behan's stories and because here was someone writing in the language of my home place, so I kind of really identified with that. So I do think that because, and sometimes when you tell American friends that you were studying the short story from the age of 12, they're amazed. But we really did study it and do close readings of short stories in school, which was brilliant. I think that's where my love of it came from, like literally from the age of 12, just loved them,
Yeah, I used to love those short stories as well, and I can still remember the Mary Lavin story that has the two different endings and the way that's written. Does anyone remember the Widow's Son? Yeah, that is such an amazing story, and it's a story that, if you take it apart and examine it, really you would think, well, this shouldn't work at all, because we're being told all along that, we're being reminded that it's a story and that there's going to be different endings, and it still really does work. So I loved those stories that we read in school, and I loved English class at school, but it wasn't something that made me want to be a writer. So I don't know why that is. I'd love to say that after reading Mary Lavin in school, that I went on and for the next 20 or 30 years I read lots of short stories, but that didn't happen. So I think there is a question of whether we believe that writing is for us or not, and it's not something I would ever have thought was for me, that it wouldn't have been a realistic career choice or something I would have done to become a writer. I didn't have a single word of fiction published anywhere until I was into my 40s. So I loved those stories, but at the same time they didn't make me think, well, I'm going to be a writer, or I could be a writer. And I think I had this real dichotomy when I was young between there were writers and there were books, and writers were men and they were dead, and books were things that I read and loved and got great enjoyment out of, but the two things are totally separate, and I would not have thought of being a writer, even though I loved books, and the books that I read, I never thought about their writers at all, and I never cared about them or wondered who they were. The writers were, it was like we were told who the writers were, Joyce and so on.
What sparked it for you?
I didn't really come to writing until I got very ill very suddenly, and I had to stop working, and I was in a job where I worked with words all the time, and I was working with words in a very creative way, and I think you know, maybe that was an outlet I had for creativity, and when that was gone, it took a different direction.
Wonderful. We've only got another 1 or 2 minutes left. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, good.
No, I'm just wondering there, you know, I heard Chekhov and Joyce mentioned, and then a lot of experimental writers whom I didn't know really. I had heard of David Foster Wallace, yes, and I wrote on Lucia Berlin just for one to watch, so to speak, you know. No, I was wondering actually what the panel would think of the short story writers that I'm familiar with, because I'd see them, I've read them to be very prominent short story writers of recent decades, probably for a general reader like myself. What am I thinking of there? Sean O'Faolain, William Trevor, John McGahern, go on to Americans, then John Updike, sorry, who's the other one I'm a bit nervous about? Sorry?
Raymond Carver.
Raymond Carver, absolutely, yeah. John Updike, who's the other great short story writer? Joan Lahiri, if you've heard of that.
Yeah, I have read all of those.
Yeah. No, I'm just wondering, maybe it wasn't meant to be conveyed, but that those kind of writers aren't adequate for conveying.
No, not at all.
No.
When you become a short story writer, when you develop a passion for it, you start to read all of those people.
Yeah.
You consume exactly all of those people you said, and so many more,
Yeah.
because you're trying to build up your own knowledge. And when you're around other short story writers, inevitably people start talking about Trevor or whoever. Jhumpa Lahiri was at this festival a few years ago. She won the Frank O'Connor Award. So yeah, I'd say every one of us has read all of them.
Can I do more a little bit?
Yeah.
Just with those, particularly the Irish authors, I have to say, to me, they were the kind of ones that I rebelled against, I suppose, from a position of pure ignorance. You know, I hadn't really read them in any depth, but they seemed to represent a tradition that I felt didn't speak to me on any kind of level of passion or inspiration. It was only so I saw them as everything not to be influenced by it, and even to kind of ignore a bad attitude. It was only much later that I got around to kind of dipping my toes in and going, oh, okay, those guys aren't so bad after all. However, they still don't particularly appeal to me.
Yeah, and they don't have to,
Yeah.
but it's good to have read them. You know, you have to have the knowledge in order, if this is what you're doing, you need to know what everyone else has done and is doing. And that's why literary journals are so important. If you want to be a short story writer, you must buy the literary journals and read them.
Yeah. Maybe a generation.
One last question. Did you have a question?
Okay.
You don't have to have. I thought you had your hand
I
up.
guess I can review of fiction myself. Like it's totally like when I read old fiction, I notice that they study mostly on emotion and love, and as it progresses on, these established writers. I don't read a lot of short stories, but I do read a lot of like novels and books and stuff. But as fiction as a whole, I notice that they study on emotion a lot, emotion of love, and there's a plot there, but the plot is not focused on, it's more about emotion. And then the writers after that, they focus on the plot. And I notice as time goes on, especially today, they try and get to the plot as fast as possible. And it's brilliant, the characters and, the characters on this journey towards this plot. And I think the emotion is kind of being forgotten out of that. And, I wonder what's your view on that, and about the importance of characters' emotion. Because I notice that when you read old authors from the 1800s, they love the idea of love. I remember reading a book where, there's this little girl in a border, and it was a very slow book. It's supposed to be a horror story, but it never got to the horror. It kept talking about the love between the daughter and the father.
It's interesting,
A lot of love, and you swear, you swear it was that, but it wasn't. It wasn't.
It's maybe about fashions changing in literature and genres, and that things have changed and we want things.
Things are more spare now.
Yeah.
You're encouraged
Yeah.
to spare.
I think it's nice though that we end this session on a note of love. Love. I feel like there's a lot of love in the room for the short story, and it feels like it's all gone very, very quickly, but it's been wonderful. We've ranged far and wide from literary magazines to live lit to things that can be done with digital and audio and new ideas. And the short story writer's being a bit bolder if you want to, and we give you permission to do that. So please could we give our panel a huge round of applause.